Right, stop scrolling because what I'm about to expose is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in British car buying. An MOT certificate is not proof that a car is mechanically sound. It is proof that a car meets a minimum legal safety standard at the exact moment it was tested, and there are 7 specific cars currently passing MOTs across Britain right now while carrying £3,000 plus mechanical problems that the MOT test was never designed to catch. Buyers see that green certificate and feel reassured. That reassurance is precisely what's costing thousands of pounds when these specific faults reveal themselves weeks or months after purchase. 1 in 6 clean passes, hiding £1,500 plus problems. And the 7 cars on today's list specifically push that statistic significantly higher because of known documented failure patterns the MOT test structurally cannot catch. Subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever bought a car with a clean MOT that then needed major work shortly after, because those experiences are exactly what this video exists to prevent for the next buyer. Let's crack on. Car number 7. Nissan Qashqai. A vehicle inspector in Norwich who conducts independent pre-purchase examinations described why this specific Qashqai variant is so dangerous for buyers relying on MOT history. The wet timing belt sits inside the engine, submerged in oil. There is nothing on the MOT checklist that examines it. A car can pass with the belt at 90% of its service life, and the test gives no indication whatsoever. The buyer sees a clean pass and assumes the engine is healthy. They have no way of knowing the belt is approaching catastrophic failure. Nothing on the checklist examines it. The buyer has no way of knowing. The specific danger compounds because the Qashqai's MOT test history, which buyers do check, correctly believing it offers useful information, shows nothing relevant to this fault category whatsoever. Multiple consecutive clean MOT passes can occur right up until the belt fails completely, because the belt's internal degradation has zero relationship to anything an MOT tester examines. I tell every client buying a DIGT-equipped Nissan to get the belt replacement history checked specifically, separate from the MOT record, the Norwich inspector said. The MOT history will tell you nothing. You need the service history showing belt replacement, or you need to budget for replacement immediately, regardless of what the MOT shows, because the MOT genuinely cannot help you here. Car number 6, Ford Focus EcoBoost. An MOT testing station manager in Bristol explained precisely what the transmission assessment during an MOT actually involves. The MOT test drive is brief, typically under a mile, often less. We're checking that the car drives, that gears engage, that there's no obvious dangerous fault. We are not stress testing the gearbox across a range of conditions that would reveal early-stage mechatronic degradation. A powershift gearbox showing mild juddering on cold start that smooths out once warm can pass that brief test drive completely cleanly. Mild juddering that smooths out, passing completely cleanly. The specific cruelty of this fault category is that the symptom pattern, present when cold, absent when warm, means an MOT conducted later in the day, after the test centre has been operating and the car has potentially been driven to the appointment, may show genuinely no symptom at all during the brief assessment window. The fault is real and progressing. The test simply doesn't create the conditions to reveal it. A transmission specialist in Leeds who frequently sees these Focus models after MOT past purchase described the typical buyer experience. Someone buys with a clean MOT, completely reasonable confidence. Within weeks, they're experiencing the cold start juddering that's been present and progressing for months. The MOT just happened to be conducted under conditions where it wasn't apparent. By the time it's obvious enough that a 1-mile test drive would catch it, the mechatronic unit is already significantly degraded and the repair cost has increased correspondingly. Car number 5. Vauxhall Astra PureTech. This is the Coventry car. The clean pass with 0 advisories. The £3,400 repair bill 6 weeks later. An MOT tester in Coventry who personally conducted the test on this specific vehicle and was subsequently contacted by the devastated buyer described the situation with evident frustration at the limitation of his own profession's testing scope. I tested that Astra. Genuinely nothing to flag. Tyres fine, brakes fine, lights fine, emissions within parameters, structural integrity sound. A completely honest, accurate MOT pass based on everything the test examines. 6 weeks later, the buyer called me asking how I'd missed the engine problem. I hadn't missed anything. The wet belt failure mode is simply not something the MOT test methodology can detect. I felt for him genuinely, but there was nothing different I could have done within the test scope. Nothing different he could have done. within the test's scope. The buyer in question, who shared his experience after being connected through the inspector's professional network, described the financial impact. "I bought this car specifically because it had a clean MOT with no advisories. I felt that was meaningful reassurance. 6 weeks later, complete engine failure on the M6, £3,400 for replacement. Nobody told me a clean MOT doesn't mean the engine is healthy. I genuinely didn't know that was possible." Car number 4, Land Rover Discovery Sport. A Land Rover specialist in Exeter described why air suspension represents a specific MOT blind spot. "The MOT checks that the suspension system functions and that there's no obvious fault at the moment of testing. The car sits at correct ride height. There's no audible air leak during the brief assessment. What it doesn't check is compressor wear approaching failure or strut seals that are degrading but haven't yet failed completely. A system that's at 80% of its remaining life looks identical to a system at 20% during a standard MOT assessment. 80% and 20% of remaining life look identical during the test." An independent vehicle inspector in Plymouth, who specifically examines air suspension systems during pre-purchase inspections, described what he checks that an MOT doesn't. "I listen to the compressor cycle time. I check for any delay in achieving correct ride height after the car has been parked overnight. I examine strut seals for the earliest signs of weeping that haven't yet become a visible leak. None of this is part of standard MOT methodology. A Discovery Sport with a compressor at the very end of its service life will pass the MOT's basic functional check completely cleanly." A Discovery Sport owner in Surrey who experienced this exact scenario described his timeline. "Bought with a clean MOT 11 weeks before the air suspension failed completely. Compressor and 2 struts needed replacement. £3,800. The seller had genuinely had no idea. His own MOT history showed clean passes throughout his ownership too. This isn't seller deception. It's a genuine MOT blind spot that nobody involved understood until it was too late." Stop. 4 cars passing MOTs while hiding catastrophic problems. The Qashqai with wet belt degradation completely invisible to MOT testing methodology. The Focus with power shift symptoms that disappear once warm, evading the brief test drive window. The Astra, the Coventry car, where even the tester himself confirmed there was nothing within his test scope that could have caught it. The Discovery Sport with air suspension components that look identical at 80% and 20% remaining life. 3 more to go. And these 3 represent failure categories that affect even more cars on British roads than the 4 already covered. Drop a comment right now. Have you ever bought a car with a clean MOT that subsequently needed major repair? Tell me what the fault was and how soon after purchase it appeared. Your experience helps build the pattern recognition that protects everyone watching this. Car number 3, BMW 3 Series 320D. A BMW independent specialist in Wolverhampton described the specific MOT limitation regarding timing chains. "There is no component of the MOT test that examines timing chain tensioner condition. The engine running check during the test confirms the engine starts, idles, and there's no obvious dangerous fault audible during a brief assessment. A timing chain tensioner approaching fatigue failure can be completely silent during that assessment window and then fail catastrophically days or weeks later. Completely silent during the assessment window, then catastrophic failure days or weeks later. The financial severity of this specific failure mode is what earns the 320D its position on this list. Unlike some MOT invisible faults that present gradually, timing chain tensioner failure on affected BMW diesel variants can occur essentially instantaneously, with the chain jumping timing and causing valve-piston contact that destroys the engine in the same way wet belt failures do. A BMW owner in Sheffield described purchasing his 320D with a completely clean MOT and full service history. Everything looked perfect on paper. 3 weeks after purchase, driving on the motorway, sudden loud noise and complete loss of power. Towed to a specialist who diagnosed timing chain failure with valve damage. £4,200 for the engine work. The MOT 3 weeks earlier had shown absolutely nothing wrong because there was nothing the test could have detected. The chain tensioner failure mode doesn't create symptoms until it actually happens. Car number 2, Mercedes-Benz A-Class. A Mercedes specialist in Southampton described the compound nature of the A-Class's MOT blind spot. The A-Class has two separate fault categories that MOT testing structurally cannot catch. The gearbox clutch pack wear progresses gradually with symptoms that can be masked by recent software updates, meaning the brief MOT test drive may show smooth operation even as the underlying mechanical wear continues. Separately, the MBUX system can have intermittent faults that simply aren't presenting at the exact moment of testing, with no warning light illuminated despite genuine underlying issues. Two separate fault categories, neither structurally catchable by MOT methodology. The specific frustration for buyers in this category is that both fault types can develop simultaneously and present together shortly after purchase, creating a compound repair bill that significantly exceeds what either fault alone would generate. A consumer advocate in Bristol who has assisted multiple A-Class buyers in this exact situation described a representative case. Buyer purchased with clean MOT, no advisories. Within 2 months, gearbox juddering became apparent, requiring eventual mechatronic replacement, and separately the infotainment system began experiencing module faults requiring replacement. Combined repair cost £5,100. The MOT had been completely accurate to its scope. It just had no scope that covered either of these specific issues. Completely accurate to its scope, which simply doesn't cover what actually mattered. Car number 1, Stellantis Group. This earns the top position because it combines the highest documented failure frequency of any entry on this list with the most complete MOT blindness. Two entirely separate fault categories, both invisible to standard testing, both capable of generating repair bills exceeding the £3,000 threshold independently. An engine specialist in Plymouth whose entire professional practice has become centered on PureTech engine failures described the wet belt component of this specific risk in terms consistent with what's been documented elsewhere across this engine family. The 1.6 PureTech shares the fundamental wet belt vulnerability with a smaller 1.2 unit. The MOT cannot detect internal belt degradation. I've serviced examples that passed clean MOTs within weeks of catastrophic belt failure. The test methodology simply doesn't extend to this component. But the 3008 and larger Astra applications carry a second independent risk that compounds the picture. A transmission specialist in Norwich described the 8-speed automatic specific MOT invisible degradation. The valve body in this transmission develops solenoid wear that produces symptoms: hesitation, hunting between gears, occasional harsh shifts that can be intermittent in early stages. An MOT test drive conducted during a period when the symptom isn't presenting will show completely normal operation. By the time the fault is consistent enough to be obvious, the valve body damage has typically progressed to requiring full replacement rather than simpler intervention. Two independent catastrophic failure pathways, neither one detectable, both capable of £3,000 plus repair bills on their own. A 3008 owner in Cardiff described the compound nightmare scenario that earns this entry top position. Bought with a clean MOT, full service history showing regular maintenance. Within 4 months, experienced both faults. The wet belt began showing degradation symptoms that my mechanic caught during a routine check before catastrophic failure, thankfully costing £2,200 for preventative replacement plus associated oil system work. Then 3 weeks after that repair, the gearbox began hunting between gears, eventually requiring valve body replacement at £2,600. Combined cost across both issues within 6 months of a clean MOT purchase, £4,800. £4,800 within 6 months of a clean MOT. The independent specialist in Plymouth offered the assessment that explains why this entry sits at number 1. Most cars on a list like this have one significant MOT blind spot. The 3008 and equivalent Astra in this specific engine and transmission combination have two independent ones operating on completely separate systems, either one of which alone would justify inclusion on this list. The probability of a buyer encountering at least one of these two issues within the first year of ownership, based on what I see professionally, is genuinely the highest of any combination I service regularly. Right then, 7 cars that pass an MOT while hiding £3,000 plus problems. Number 7, Nissan Qashqai 1.3 DIGT, wet timing belt degradation, invisible to MOT methodology, multiple clean passes possible right up until catastrophic engine failure. Number 6, Ford Focus 1.0 EcoBoost automatic, power shift, cold start juddering that disappears when warm, evading the brief MOT test drive window. Number 5, Vauxhall Astra 1.2 PureTech, the Coventry case, where the tester himself confirmed nothing within the test's scope could have caught the fault. Number 4. Rover Discovery Sport. Air suspension components at 80% and 20% remaining life, appearing identical during basic functional MOT assessment. Number 3. BMW 320D. Timing chain tensioner fatigue failure occurring essentially without warning, completely silent until catastrophic. Number 2. Mercedes A-Class. Compound gearbox and infotainment faults, neither presenting at the exact moment of MOT testing. Number 1. Stellantis 3008 and Astra 1.6 PureTech. 2 independent MOT invisible failure pathways, £4,800 combined repair cost within 6 months documented. The lesson across all 7 is consistent and important. A clean MOT tells you the car met minimum legal safety standards at the moment of testing. It tells you almost nothing about gearbox internal wear, timing belt or chain condition, suspension component fatigue, or electrical system degradation that hasn't yet triggered a visible symptom. Before buying any used car, especially the 7 specific models covered today, commission an independent pre-purchase inspection that goes beyond MOT scope. Checking service history for component-specific maintenance like belt replacement, testing gearbox behavior cold rather than relying on a brief warm test drive, and assessing suspension component condition beyond basic functional check. The cost? Typically £100 to £200. The protection against the failures described today? Potentially thousands? Drop a comment. Tell me if you've experienced any of these specific scenarios. A clean MOT followed by major unexpected repair. And tell me which of these 7 surprised you most. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Right then, that's it from me today. Thanks for watching, and remember, the MOT certificate tells you the car is legal. It was never designed to tell you the car is healthy. See you next time. Cheers!